Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you may be. This is Firoze Manji coming live from the Daraja Press. Today is the fourth of our discussions on this extraordinary book, Fanon Today, Reason and Revolt of the Wretched of the Earth. Nigel Gibson is joining us today as he's the editor. And we'll be discussing the relevance of Fanon to today's struggles in Northern Ireland, in Kenya, and Pakistan. Yes, and I hope I will be able to remember how to pronounce Feargal's name. Our first guest is Feargal Mac Ionnrachtaigh, I think. And he's a first-generation Irish speaker and a product of the Irish medium education system in Belfast. He studied at Queen's University Belfast, and his doctoral thesis was published as a book, Language, Resistance and Revival, Republican Prisoners and the Irish Language in the North of Ireland. And it's just amazing to have a chapter in this book that deals with Northern Ireland, Fanon's relevance to Northern Ireland. It would never occurred to me that indeed that would be Fanon would have such an impact on the thinking around Northern Ireland and language. Our other next guest is Wangui Kimari. And Wangui is a bit delayed in a taxi into Nairobi, but she'll be here soon. She's the participatory action research coordinator for the Mathare Social Justice Centre in Nairobi, Kenya. Mathare is one of the big shack dwellers area in which she works. Where this organization seeks to promote social justice through engaged community and movement platforms. She wrote a chapter on looking for justice in a compartmentalized world, 80 mothers and police killings in Kenya. Our next guest is Ayyaz Malik, who's a political worker at the Awami Workers Party from Karachi, Pakistan, a left-wing party focused on organizing workers, peasants, students, and women. He recently completed his PhD from York University, Toronto, and is currently a lecturer in Human Geography at the University of Liverpool. His research interests are in Marxist and postcolonial theory, with a focus on labor, urban politics, and social movements in Pakistan. He wrote on Pakistan, the Immediacy of Frantz Fanon. I'm sure that Wangui will be joining us soon. One of the people we'd hoped to have had on board today was Razan Ghazzawi. Unfortunately, she's not able to join us because of other commitments today, but we hope to interview her later. So a very warm welcome to all of you, and to Nigel Gibson, who is the editor of this extraordinary collection of more than 23 essays. I'm sure all of you will know Nigel as an activist scholar specializing in the work of the Algerian revolutionary Frantz Fanon, and he's the author of Fanon, the Postcolonial Imagination, which won the 2009 Caribbean Philosophy Frantz Fanon Outstanding Book Award, which has been translated into Arabic in 2013. And also Fanonian Practices in South Africa, from Steve Biko to Abahlali Basmondolo, and many, many other publications, but we will leave it at that point. And let me hand over to you, Nigel, to welcome our guests.
Thank you so much, Feroze. It's a great pleasure, and indeed excitement to think about the struggles in the north of Ireland, the struggles in Pakistan, and the struggles in Kenya through engagements with these authors, thinking through Fanon's concepts. in a certain sense, and Ayyaz mentions this, and we were talking about Atu Sekjiatu previously, and his concept of partisan universalism, and Ayyaz uses it in his essay, and I'm thinking of that as a kind of grounded concept that Fanon, 60 years after the publication of The Wretched of the Earth, can speak to intellectuals and activists in three very different post-colonial situations, which of course are different, but on the other hand have similarities. In this particular case, thinking about Belfast, thinking about Karachi, and thinking about Nairobi. So with that in mind, I thought before introducing each author's chapter and our authors talking about their chapters, that I could basically ask the authors to think about, well, how did they come across Fanon in these situations? And what did Fanon, how did you come across Fanon? And what engaged you about Fanon that made it relevant to your particular particular thinking and particular struggles? So with that in mind, I thought I'd put Feargal on the spot to start, and then Ayyaz, and hopefully by then Wangui will have come. If not, then we'll move on to start talking about the chapters themselves. So Feargal and Fanon, can you give us some sense?
Well, Nigel, thanks very much. I suppose I was thinking about this yesterday when I was just we were in the middle of a festival. During one of the organisations I work for have a festival called Feargal Mac Ionnrachtaigh, which is a local grassroots community festival under the straplines politics, participation and community. And a lot of the stuff that we do is creating spaces for debate and discussion and activism. And that's what's and this is what got me thinking about this, because for my experience with Fanon, my first reference point was when I was carrying out a PhD. Now, my PhD was focusing on the Irish language revival in the North, but focusing also on Republican prisoners. My father had been incarcerated. I come from a Republican community. The people who had taught me in the Irish school I attended, which was originally a hedge school, which was unfunded by the state and was embroiled in a political struggle with the British state for recognition in the 80s and in the 90s. My father had learned Irish, so that was where my interest in this story or this research matter came to pass. And while I was interviewing a Republican ex-prisoner, he mentioned to me about how the prisoners read Frantz Fanon, and I had heard of him because my father had a copy of Black Skin's White Mass, which I had read briefly. I had heard of Wretched, but I hadn't got around reading it. And these prisoners were talking about how Fanon in the 70s and in the 80s, while they were in jail, was a Babel of struggle. And one of the reasons why this was the case was because these were people who were engaged in a war of liberation against the British state in Ireland. And in the area I'm from, with this building I'm speaking from is an area called Ballymurphy. People may have heard of in recent years. There's been a long-running campaign in relation to the Ballymurphy massacre, where we had 11 civilians here who were killed in August 1871 when the British state imposed internment without trial in the north here. And what you had was a community completely and utterly being oppressed under 24-hour military occupation and being murdered in the street. 6 months after, the civil rights movement was killed off the street by the British Army, and what you had was the civil rights movement becoming untenable. And of course, Fanon in that opening chapter concerning balance talks about balance as a cleansing force in the context of overt systemic colonial violence. And this is, I think, why the Babel of Wretched was so important to the prisoners, because in a sense it was giving them a vantage point for their own involvement in armed struggle, but also the cultural revival element came through in the sense that they were reading about anti-colonial struggles across the world. People like Bobby Sands, who was a hunger striker, who would later die on hunger strike, who was a political activist, who was very well read, who was into theory, who was into the language, and was beginning to join these dots together in terms of the language revival taking place on the outside and the struggle of prisoners in the inside. So that is where I suppose the first part of Wretched comes in to the struggle. But what I was thinking about last night was how, in my own involvement in activism, how the reading of the book became much more than the research. And the chapter which kind of had a huge impact on myself was, of course, chapter 3, the pitfalls of national consciousness. And one of the reasons why it was so important is because it was speaking to our real life situation as activists who were promoting the language, who were trying to find a way to promote the language available and the struggle of the Republican community within the confines of the British state in Ireland. And what you had was, in the lead up to the re-establishment of the Stormont power sharing arrangements in 2007, you had a protracted elite negotiation, and a lot of the issues, some engaged activists like myself were quite critical about the way a lot of this was going, about the fact there was no debate and discussion, and about the fact that there wasn't a space to think through alternatives, to speak about alternatives. And here I was reading Fanon, who was talking about in the year after liberation, commemorations are used by great leaders to keep the masses in turn. And you're reading this going, this is very similar to what I'm seeing is happening here. So, and as you'll see in the chapter, as we've spoken about, this comes into the chapter when we speak about Andram Jarrig movement, and that was very much, I would argue, the Fanonian practices of the contemporary movement there was to try and pick some of this, and a lot of the arguments and debates and discussions and context were radically different from that of the 70s and 80s when there was a war of liberation, because it was happening post-war, it was happening post-peace process, it was happening post-negotiation, and it made effectively chapter 3 so important and so relevant, and it felt like you were reading about where we were in 2005, 2006, even though this book had been written in 1961, which was so mind-blowing about the book. So it started off, as I said, coming to me by default, and it ended up becoming much more significant.
Great, thank you, Feargal. In fact, it was Ayyaz's biographical beginnings to his chapter that made me think of this question, and so Ayyaz, I know you talk about this, but perhaps you want to re-engage that question.
Yeah, thank you so much, Nigel, first of all, for asking me to write this chapter. It was something which had been brewing in my mind for a long time, and the fact that you asked me to write it kind of forced me to get it all out when I did it, and also to Feroze and Daraja Press for organizing the publication, and of course this conversation between with the comrades from all over the world. So in terms of kind of encountering Fanon, I mean, Nigel, you've hinted at this, and I talk about this in my chapter. This for me, this happened around the same time, I think, as Feargal. This is the year 2008-11, and for me, me and people of my generation kind of had their political awakening in Pakistan with the anti-dictatorship movement against General Musharraf, who was the American-backed dictator through the late 1990s and mid-2000s, early 2000s in Pakistan. And myself, I was coming out of high school when this movement started against General Musharraf. And me and many other people of our generation who were just kind of coming into adolescence and adulthood were part of it, and a lot of us thought that once democracy is restored, things will improve, right? Rule for the people, by the people, and by the people and for the people. But of course it didn't, right? And a lot of that time, so the post-2008 moment was a kind of time of confusion, almost kind of flailing around for answers as to when all these faces have changed, and we have a government which is now elected by the people, ostensibly or formally elected by the people, but has more or less continued on the same path, the same practices of imperialist dependency, oppression of the peripheral areas, one after the other, IMF program, and all the deprivations and scarcities which come with it. And at that point, when I was studying in England at the time, and I was a science student at the time, not a social science student. I did my first degree in biochemistry, and I used to kind of wander the libraries of the social science library at my university, just randomly, and I randomly came across this title which sounded very, very curious, which was The Wretched of the Earth, and I kind of just picked it up and I went back, and that night I started reading it. And it's hard to encapsulate in words as to the effect, of course, of Jean-Paul Sartre's preface, but also when Fanon starts from decolonization as a historical process, and and especially so someone the chapter on violence and concerning violence was not something that really shocked me that much, simply because I had grown up in Karachi in the 1990s, a place for various reasons, which was, a hotbed of kind of urban militancy and so on and so forth. But the chapter which really clicked with me at that moment was the pitfalls of national consciousness. And it was, what Marx and Engels almost called in the Communist Manifesto that, when man is compelled to face with sober senses his real conditions of life, right? So, and Fanon was almost, that chapter was almost, that douse of cold water, which forced me, and I hope many others like me, to face with sober senses our real conditions of life. And what are the real conditions of life? The real conditions of life were Fanon asking us questions about if this post-independence ruling bloc, or for in our case the so-called democratic civilian ruling bloc, what coherent hegemonic project does it have? What sustainable basis of accumulation does it have? What kind of project of inclusion or exclusion does it have? Right? Hold on. What kind of vision, both kind of ideological and material, has it offered Pakistan's kind of toiling masses beyond the obfuscations of kind of patriotism and religion and so on and so forth? So Fanon, was very. That chapter was extremely relevant because it took us, it took at least me out of this kind of despondency almost, that authoritarian or that one authoritarianism is our fate, right? That all problems in Pakistan, for example, can be reduced down to this binary of civilian democracy versus military dictatorship. Plus, also, of course, he did not fall into the opposite, that that authoritarianism, dictatorship is somehow a cultural, ontological marker of the black and brown peoples of the world, right? So Fanon was asking us all these tough questions, all these materialist questions, as to what are the social, material, institutional inadequacies of in Fanon's words, the national bourgeoisie, or what I would call in more Gramscian language, the postcolonial ruling bloc, which then compels it to resort to a strategy of authoritarianism, of almost fascistic kind of practices, this kind of patriotic bluster, which basically is kind of papering over the cracks and kind of weak sutures, which at some point or the other come off, and then we have the next round of military dictatorship. So Fanon was, that chapter came to me at that moment where things had changed, but they hadn't really changed. And then instead of falling into some kind of cynicism, into some kind of understanding that this is a culturally ordained disposition of brown people, that only and this is a widespread view even in Pakistan, that this is a nation which is only responsive to the danda, or to the colonial kind of baton, if I may call it, or to military rule. Basically, Fanon was asking us, okay, we actually have to go to the social and material and historical roots of where this kind of authoritarianism, where this, what he called the state which arouses the people's anxiety instead of calming them, where does that state originate from, and how does it why does it take on this appearance, why does it take on this role whereby it continues, instead of kind of making people what Fanon would call actional, it continues to fixate people, it continues to fix them, and objectify them, and in Césaire's words, thingify them. And at that is where for me that first encounter with Fanon, as I said, was like Feargal. It was about the pitfalls of national consciousness, and then of course I had other kind of encounters with Fanon, with other Pakistani comrades, but that was the first one, the pitfalls of national consciousness. That drowse of cold water which forces men to face up to soberly face up to his real conditions of life.
All right. Well, we're very pleased to have Wangui finally join us. Nigel, perhaps you take on Wangui to talk about how she came across Fanon.
Wangui, lovely to see you.
Thank you all, and sorry for popping in later than intended.
No problem.
Yeah, don't worry. We were forewarned. So I before asking everyone to talk about their chapters, I wanted to, because I was kind of so interested in a certain sense in making connections between the struggles in the north of Ireland, Karachi, or basically even more specifically than that, Belfast, Karachi, and Nairobi. I was thinking, well, what drew the authors to Fanon? What was it about Fanon that spoke to you? So that was essentially the opening question.
No, and thank you. I'm sorry I missed the discussion about our comrade from Ireland, how he got to Fanon. I'm happy to have caught Ayyaz's discussion. And for me, it was very, like most boring middle-class people like myself, it is kind of accidental. And I accredit the fact that I went to University of Dar es Salaam for 1 year. And when I was there, I had a good group of comrades who were reading Walter Rodney, who were reading Fanon. And that's when I first heard about Fanon. I never heard about Fanon in any of my secondary or primary education. And I came back to Fanon. I mean, what really struck me when I read him in, I would say, early 2000s, was the fact that he was describing what I was seeing so much. For example, how the geography of post-colonial African cities, whether it's Dar es Salaam or Nairobi, they still have a very discernible colonized sector and in the colonial sector. And I came back to that in my work as a graduate student, just trying to think about urban space without all the jargon of academia, just trying to think about urban planning as the logics behind urban planning and not just describing segregation without the logics. And Fanon was really instrumental in describing that in ways that were very grounded. He's saying the colonized sector, the colonial sector is a place of lights, of paved roads, and it's that distinction is still valid till the present. And so I was happy to come back to Fanon many years later, but always in ways that were really pertinent in describing not just phenomena, because we describe phenomena all the time, but the logics behind certain phenomena. And that's how I came to it, briefly.
Okay, thank you. Partly the question was also promoted by the way you start your chapter, talking about, with the personal stories of the women, which and I'll return to ask you about your chapter in a minute.
Sure.
But just to get back to put it, to Feargal, what interests me also I was rereading your chapter. It took me a little while, and I'm sure in your presentation on your chapter you won't be able to get into all the detail because it is quite complex in a certain sense for a reader without much knowledge, but it is an excellent overview. What I really appreciated was, and what got me thinking was the fact that in a certain way the struggle, the anti-imperialist struggle in that came out of, after the revolt in 1916, and then through to the early 1920s. The fact that the fact of in a certain sense, the counter-revolution, is exactly what, in a certain way, Fanon is talking about in the third chapter of the Pitfalls of national consciousness. So that was something that I thought was especially important to me in terms of the kind of historical narrative that you draw. With that being said, let me be quiet and ask you to just give a brief overview of your chapter, and especially on the in a certain sense the post Good Friday chords, because in a certain way that kind of reiterates some of the stuff that was experienced in the 1920s and through that period after from the Civil War to the kind of counter-revolution.
Thanks very much, Nigel. First of all, I wanted to give Nigel a plug, because obviously myself and Nigel go back to when I met Nigel. And this is interesting because back to Fanon, when I finished my PhD in 2009, my urge was to get back to the community and back to a struggle rather than continue in the academy. That you can't be an activist academic, as we know, but back to Fanon's warning about praxis, there was a big urge to get back and to implement some of the stuff on a full-time basis, and that's what I did. And I just happened to see an advert for the 50th anniversary conference for Fanon in Paris, and it was there that I met Nigel, and I spoke, and myself and Nigel became friendly. Then when I finished, when I published my PhD as a book, 2013, I went out to Boston, and Nigel was glad to host me. But I want to make a quick point here about the importance of connections and international connections. I think it fits perfectly well with the importance of this talk here today. When we brought Nigel over to Belfast in 2017 to speak about his work, it just so happened that an activist colleague of mine who works for a human rights NGO in Belfast, based in the Practice of Rights Project, who I would argue have a very Fanonian approach in terms of their empowerment from the bottom up and handing human rights tools to those who are excluded. And their main focus, like a core element of the work, was housing. And Sean Brady, as it happened, was going to South Africa to meet countless activist groups, and I put him in touch with Nigel, and Nigel then changed his plans. And when I had met Nigel in 2012, I had bought his brilliant book on Abathali and Fanon, and I had given this to my comrade Sean, who then went to Durban and met with Abathali, and even met with countless activist groups, but this was the group with whom he had the greatest affinity. And then we brought Tapelo Mohepe to Belfast in 2018, and we had him in this very building speaking. And to me, that's what all this is about. It's about creating those international connections. And if I hadn't went there to meet Nigel, none of this would have happened, and we wouldn't have made those connections with the Shack to Irish movement. And I think that's important because Feroze was saying at the beginning about Ireland being in this, and that for me is what I'm most proud of, is that Ireland is in with this fantastic batch of chapters from across the world, because believe it or not, there's a huge debate, and the dominant academic discourse in Ireland would be to say that Ireland isn't actually a colony at all, when of course all the evidence presents a contrary view. And I won't go into huge detail about this in the talk, because as Nigel says, it's laboured in great detail in the chapter. But I think for our purposes, Ireland was the guinea pig of the British colonial global project. Its nearest neighbour, and all the horrific methodology that would be practiced and with terror across the world was used in Ireland firstly. And Fanon talked about this, about the totalitarian nature of colonial exploitation, about the negation of values, about destroying and disfiguring the native. And that's very much what happened in Ireland. And from the 1600s on, a Tudor conquest, we had a period of plantation leading on to fast forward to the 19th century. And the Irish language, which was the language of the poor in Ireland, became completely excluded from all levels of government and advancement in what became an Anglican Protestant state, which at that stage was one unitary state within the British Empire. After the rebellion of 1788, British imposed an Act of Union, which to a large degree is still in place in relation to the northern state, although a lot of us are over the moon that that's dismantling at breakneck pace at present, but we'll come back to that at a later date. But so that was the narrative, and then, as I said, the practices with the imposition of the national school system in Ireland followed in the aftermath by the Great Hunger, whereby people may have heard it's described as a famine, but there was plenty of food in Ireland to feed the poor. The food was being transported by the empire, and over 1 million people died of starvation, and over 2 million people emigrated. All those who suffered were monolingual Irish speakers, and that's a hugely, and we're still, I believe, unpacking and living with the colonial legacy and the traumatic legacy of Ngortamore, or the famine, or the Great Hunger, as it's alternatively known. And in the aftermath of that, what you had in Ireland was that this is where Fanon comes in my view, because the revival, the cultural revival, which would precede the revolution that Nigel talked about in 1816, very much mirrors the Fanonian three-stage approach that he would go on to talk about. And of course, this was happening before Fanon was writing and before Fanon was active. And one of the things that he spoke about, which is something that I have used continually thereafter, is the fact that in the context of colonization, anywhere where a language, an excluded and minoritized, brutalized culture or language is revived, is it is avowedly political. So he talked about the fight for national culture means in the first instance the fight for the liberation of the nation, the material keystone which makes the building of a culture possible. And this is one of the things that's come through again and again. Empire has imposed a discourse on the language, that the language is okay if it is depoliticized, and this is the term myself and Feroze were speaking about this at the outset, about the depoliticization of culture being a neoliberal agenda ultimately, and this idea that the Irish language should become depoliticized is a means to foster and embed and entrench its exclusion. So it's okay to speak the Irish language, and Fanon talked about this, talked about little known cultural treasures to avoid the colonizer blushing for shame. And so this is again one of the things that came to pass when we look at Ireland. But the fast forward on to, as Nigel talked about, the Easter Rising of 1916, there was a rebellion. The British Empire went into a period of negotiation with those, and we're commemorating 100 years of the Wangui Treaty this year, where Ireland was partitioned. And arguably, as Nigel was saying, what you had in the southern state was exactly what Fanon had warned about. So what you had was the revolutionary structure being divided, there being an imposed civil war, the Anglo-Irish Treaty or Agreement being signed under the threat of immediate and terrible war, and you had one of the leaders of the revolutionaries using British guns to attack his former comrades. And what you had was a very, very bloody 3-year civil war. Over 4,000 people were killed. But the new system, the new government, the newly independent state was exactly what revolutionaries like James Connolly had warned about. He, writing back in 1901, had said that you could paint the paint boxes green, but unless you said about the organisation of a socialist republic, all your efforts would be in vain. And what you had was a new neo-colonial elite donning the wigs of the British system and imposing the same unequal system on the Irish poor. And this is ultimately what happened in the southern states. So the counter-revolution that Nigel talked about saw the formation of two states. So you had a settler colonial fascist state in the north, which became Northern Ireland, which unfortunately is still here. And you had in the southern state, you had an autocratic Catholic backwater, which, I mean, in recent years, I mean, divorce was only outlawed in the 80s. We're continually dealing with the legacy of Magdalene Laundries, mother and baby homes. Women were treated horrifically. So you had two failed states in Ireland. And this is ultimately at present, there's a huge debate about United Ireland and about a new country in the era of Brexit. So it's also a very exciting time in terms of Ireland and in terms of the way they're struggling in that sense. But I suppose to fast forward to the core essence, as Nigel was talking about, Where does Fanon come into the struggle in the north of Ireland? I mentioned earlier on about the prisons, and I think it was really, really important because what was happening is through experience, through the lived experience of being involved in a struggle against the British Empire and against British occupation in Ireland, some of those people who found themselves incarcerated found Fanon, and they were beginning to immediately relate it. I mean, I have a quote here from Jim McCann, for example, who talked about learning the language in the context of being incarcerated in the 70s in Belfast. And he says, our motivation to learn the language was its politics. We recognised the Lanks imperialists want to destroy our language and reason from this that it must be important. While we were in jail, we began to break all these things down and work out why we had got here and what we could do to change things. So again, he's just beginning to unpack exactly what people like Fanon had spoke about. And of course, Paul Freire as well talked about the empowering form of education, whereby people would go from a banking approach, where they would become an agent of change, where they would begin to unpack their own social cultural reality in the context of their own lived experience. And I think that's one of the things that came to pass when it comes to the Irish experience. For following that, what we had was, again, and this is related in the chapter in a bit more detail, what we had was a criminalisation process whereby the British government would remove political status from the prisoners and impose a criminalisation process whereby prisoners would be made to wear a prison garb. They would lose all the rights to free association. And of course, in Irish history, this had a huge symbolism, and there was a huge campaign against this. And what you had was prisoners would refuse to wear the uniform. A first prisoner was thrown into the cell and wrapped himself in a blanket. He was thrown into the cell. Of course, he was naked. He wrapped himself in a blanket, and he became the blanket man, the first blanket man. There was 300 others who would join him on the protest. But the language again would become a means of survival. And this were people who because of the system in the north of Ireland, which, as I mentioned earlier on, was essentially a neo-colonial settler state, where the Irish language was banned and excluded, so you couldn't learn Irish language in school. So to learn the act of learning the Irish language became an act of the subaltern. It became an act of fighting back and challenging. So you had to do it in hiding from the state. But parallel to the struggle that was happening on the inside in the prisons, on the outside there was also a small cohort of working class Republican activists who had decided to establish their own Irish language speaking community, and they had began developing a number of cooperatives. Now these were rooting their politics and their action in the civic virtue of the French Revolution. And both these, on the inside and the outside, both these actions were coming together. They were being thought through, and they were coming together in a form of praxis. And ultimately, Fanon found voice within that context because, again, there was military occupation. To learn the Irish language was a clear, overt act of struggle. And in my own experience, as somebody who attended Irish language schools during that period of time, we were inculcated, I believe, with the same belief, the same narrative as you were seeing what was happening all around you. I spoke about it in the intro, the fact that I went to a secondary school which was denied its funding. The campaign for the school to receive its recognition became embroiled in the emerging peace process in the early 1990s, as the war was beginning to wind down, as there was negotiations for a settlement, as Nigel had mentioned, would culminate in the Good Friday Agreement of 1998, which was to usher in a new era. But in a real sense, it was to usher in a new era without any structural change. So the nationalists who would become excluded would be able to share power. So what had been an orange state would become a sectarian state, would become a shared state between nationalists and unionists. And ultimately, Republicans at the time who were agreeing, there was a huge debate within the Republican nationalist community. Was it the right thing to do, or was it the wrong thing to do? There was an argument that it was strategic, that it was a means to unpack. It was a welcome way out of protracted armed struggle, but at the same time, it was argued that it would be a stepping stone to a more peaceful way to achieve United Ireland. And that was the argument that was made at the time. But one of the things that people like ourselves began to find is that once the British government could no longer be called the enemy, once we became back into what Fanon talked about, this ossified national consciousness, oftentimes when Irish language activists were trying to implement and promote the struggle on the outside, what they had found was that some of the barriers that had been historically placed there by empire was now being placed there by former friends and colleagues and comrades. And a lot of this was happening inadvertently, a lot of it was happening unconsciously, but it created this dynamic whereby there was tension within Republican civil society during this period of time. And one small example of this, which I tell in the chapter, and we're going to perhaps unpack in questions, was the school I was speaking about had a campaign for a bus pass for the kids in the school. Now, the person who became a Minister of Education at that time was somebody who was an Irish language speaker, who was from a Republican background, a woman called Katrina Razan. But once she became to become a Minister of Education within the Stormont regime, the civil servants and the bureaucrats in power had interlocked her in the system, whereby she wasn't able, according to her, to implement this. So what happened was there was a court case taken by the school against the Ministry of Education, who at that stage was being headed up by somebody who was a former friend and a former colleague. And there was a huge debate about this at the time in the area. How could a school take a Sinn Féin minister at the time, the court and whatever else. And the judge came down on behalf of the school and demanded that the bus was provided. But the bus wasn't provided until there was a campaign from below. And in the spaces of activism from below, during that period of time, for 2013-14, in terms of the bus campaign, is the time for me where Fanon become most relevant, where the spectre of Fanon was to be found in those rooms, in those activist rooms, whereby people were declaring his revolutionary humanism and were declaring themselves members and participants in history, but with the floodlights of history upon them. And this again would bring us into the Dara campaign. People may have heard about the Northern Ireland government in 2017 collapsing. It was collapsing. There was various reasons for the collapse of the government. The primary reason was a corrupt scandal around RHI, which I haven't got time to go into in my talk here today. But what happened in the middle of it all is that the unionist politicians, again deriving from that colonial legacy, who were in power in Stormont, would continually use the Irish language and Irish language speakers as a punch bag. So I talk about it in the book as the straw that broke the camel's back was the removal of a fund for Irish language impoverished young people to go and spend time in Irish language speaking areas in the south of Ireland. And there was a huge campaign around this. And over a 3-week period, it was eventually overturned. But before that, Sinn Féin, who would be a Republican, the nationalist leading party, were brought under such pressure from below that they collapsed Stormont, and Stormont had no government. And what happened in the election thereafter, they were rewarded with a majority. So in the Republican working class areas, people who perhaps become disillusioned with the direction of the peace process were flocking back in droves to this stance of bringing down Stormont during that period of time. And in the middle of this, you had the language movement, and in the middle of this, you had the work that we do here. And as I argued again, the organising methodology was non-party political, non-hierarchical, and I would argue Fanonian in its essence. And again, I've unpacked this in detail in the paper. Perhaps Nigel can come back and ask about this in questions. But one of the arguments that I have made is that the methodology of struggle, which delivered a number of successes and victories, has politicised a whole generation of young people in community organising and community activism, who I would argue, and I'm very hopeful, will be the leaders of tomorrow and the future. And one of the things, the reason why this is important, and have argued this at the conclusion, is that in the debate around United Ireland, the debate in a sense is when, not if. So people aren't saying, is there going to be a United Ireland? All the opinion polls are showing that that's the way it's going. Increasingly, Brexit has shown that Northern Ireland as a state is more untenable than it has ever been. But one of the things that's perhaps missing from the argument is what type of country will we have? Are we going to unite two failed states? And are we going to return to the haunting message that Fanon had, that unless there's socio-economic change, all we're doing is implementing colonialism in a neo-colonial model? Or are we going to think through the transformation of society? And this is one of the arguments that I made in the conclusion, because the methodology that was used by Daraja, a methodology that was used by young people from the Republican community who organised and who arguably achieved massive success because they were organised independent of the state, independent of political parties, I believe, has shown the way for a participatory mass movement, which is ultimately what is needed, I believe, if we're going to achieve a republic, a socialist republic that's befitting of the struggle of the Irish people over the last many hundreds of years.
Thank you, Feargal. Want to shift gears in a certain sense to Wangui, not because the struggle is any less important, but because it operates in a kind of different in a different sector. That is to say, her chapter begins with what could be considered personal stories, and then ends with a new movement, and it's about police violence in another, one could consider it another failed state, which is Kenya, built on the top of and still existing in the kind of sectoral compartmentalized world that Fanon talks about, Nairobi, but also interestingly, I think, and this connects also to Ayyaz's chapter, one of the stories which I know Wangui will tell us about, one of the mothers stories of the murder of her son is actually in the northeast, where there's a certain kind, and this operates also within the sort of post 9/11 Islamophobia, where young people, young men are considered terrorists because they are Muslim, but also because they exist in these kind of peripheral or marginalized areas, working in the northeast of Kenya. And I think that's kind of interestingly connects back to what Feargal's talking about, but also what Ayyaz is talking about in his chapter. In other words, these compartments, these legacies of colonial rule, these ways of dehumanizing ways, and these structures of authority, and as Feargal just mentioned, the kind of neo-fascist element of it in the north of Ireland also exists in these militarized situations in both Kenya and Pakistan. So with that being said, Wangui, do you want to introduce your chapter?
So thank you so much, Nigel. I'm really happy to be here and be part of a space where we are discussing how Fanon's work is so important in Ireland and Pakistan, and also for mothers in Kenya. And so this chapter, which I'm grateful for the opportunity to have written, details the work of a group called the Mothers of Victims and Survivors Network in Kenya, and mostly in poor urban settlements like Mathare, where I was today, Korogocho and Dandora. And it's detailing some of their work, which really, for most, I guess, for the state, seemed initially very benign, because it's just mothers coming together, even if they're coming together to grieve because of intentional state violence or the extrajudicial killings of their children. But it also details how they grow when they realize, and Fanon talks about this, of course, that they breathe the same air as the colonialists, they breathe the same way as the post-colonial elite. And so that sparks, as they come to this understanding within themselves and through their grief and beyond the grief, that sparks so many important movements, and it helps us discern particular violences that endure and that we wouldn't know, for example, as a middle-class person, but the violences that endure in this compartmentalized society, but the different ways that challenging it and usurping it become possible. And so this chapter really details, for example, the experience of Mama Alex, who whose child was killed outside our center in Mathare, and she has to pass that space every day. Or Mama Nura Malicha, who we were talking about, whose 17-year-old son was killed, and he's from northeastern Kenya, and so that for the police already fits the profile of young Muslim terrorists, and so that justifies his erasure and the erasure of so many young people. It talks also about the journey of Mama Victor, whose two sons were killed on the same day during the elections in 2017, but how they come together to grieve because of this loss that happens because they live in the colonized sector that still has the stigma and the logics imprinted within it that were made possible by colonization. But it also details their awakening and their desire they look for justice both in their colonized sector, but their desire and their bid to go also to the colonial sector and what this means for them. And so this chapter details that briefly. It details the work they're doing. It grounds them within Fanonian practices, even if for many of them, they don't know who Fanon is. Although there's a quote by a young activist within this movement who also talks about how we're the wretched of the earth and we just need to fight for ourselves. And so that's what it details, and I'm happy that it has resonance in Pakistan, it has resonance in Ireland, and it's just a little contribution to showing the impact of Fanon, but how work for dignity, for land, for self-determination continues, and in ways that resonate so greatly with his writing, which attended to this in many ways so much better than any other writer that I've come across. And his ability to foresee these enduring dynamics of the colonial sector or the colonized sector, but the ways in which people come into themselves to challenge this colonialism. And so this chapter is just a humble contribution to document that, but grounded in that anchored in a movement of women that people would see denying it's just mothers, but it traces how they have this in coming together, in discerning and asserting that they're politicizing their struggles and asserting that they're the wretched of the earth, that they live in a colonized sector, allowing us to discern aspects of the violence that endures, the colonial violence that endures to today, but above all, new possibilities for challenging, for looking for justice. So I think I'll stop there.
Thank you, Wangui. I mean, I think that's important, an important element of all the movements that we're talking about, the abilities to come together and share experiences, and think about experiences and the commonality of experiences. That it's not individual, it's not isolated, but in fact these are common experiences that, and by sharing them, gives a sense of a sense of power and commonality. In a certain way, there's another connection to Ayyaz. You talk about the Baloch struggle. That Pakistan is seen as the unitary state, but in fact, the question of the question of language and culture that Feargal talks about is also connected to some of the issues that you talk about. And I'm also wondering, maybe I'll get back to Wangui and ask her the question about the question of language, and so also in those struggles. So Ayyaz, do you want to speak a little bit more about your chapter?
Yeah. Thank you, Nigel, and thank you, Wangui and Feargal. Again, I really enjoyed reading your chapters, and I'm disappointed that Razan wasn't here because I was reading her chapter last night. And again, another chapter which focuses a lot on the use of language and words, and the density of language and how important that is. So what I'll do is, with your permission, I wrote a condensed talk based on this chapter, and I also made some slides So if I have permission, I can share that, and it's not long. It will take about 10-12 minutes for me to read through it, and I think it will be more visual. Is that okay?
Yeah,
it's okay with me.
You can share your screen.
Okay, yeah, I'll do that. So I'll be repeating a bit of the stuff, but I'll come to the other immediacies of Fanon in a bit. The Baloch window. Okay, now I'm just sharing my PowerPoint. Okay, can you see the PowerPoint?
No.
Okay.
Can you beam it across to me and I'll put it up?
Okay. Should I? How should I do it?
Just send it to me by email and I'll put it up.
Just give me 2 seconds. Sorry, guys.
Oh, no problem.
I didn't realize that. I thought it would be just like Zoom.
It is just like Zoom. There's the same problems.
That's correct. That is correct. Okay. So I am sending you the Google Drive link. Oh shit! I sent it to Wangui. Sorry. Rose, you're in it now as well. Okay.
Well, while we're waiting on that, Nigel, I mean, the name Nigel Gibson is so intimately associated with writings on Fanon. We haven't heard from you as to how you came across Fanon.
Well, the short story. I was after graduating from the University of Wales at Aberystwyth. I was living in a housing cooperative, which was basically a legalized squat, and then I was also squatting in London in like 1980-81, which happened to be also the year of the hunger strikes in the north of Ireland, and also the urban black and white revolt in across the cities of England. And I had come across this book by John Allen and Lou Turner. And Lou Turner, in fact, is in the Fanon Today book and spoke at an earlier meeting that we had. And their book was called Frantz Fanon, Soweto, and American Black Thought. And at this time, I'd come across it a few years earlier. And at this time, I'd also been in contact with activists from the Black Consciousness movement in London, who just opened up an office in like 1980. And I'd met them in 80-81. And I was actually thinking about, I was reading Fanon, and I was thinking about the struggle in the north of Ireland, thinking about Fanon, and also thinking about the struggle in Britain, the anti-Thatcher struggle, but essentially the revolt of the black and white youth, that led by black youth in Brixton and Toxteth and so forth. So Fanon was very much like the other the other speakers today, was very concrete for that moment. And the interesting thing is, that I've probably read The Wretched of the Earth every year since, and every year there's something new in what Fanon is saying. But that was how I came across Fanon. It was really through John Allen and Lou Turner's book, and then thinking about that specific moment, 1980, 81, also, well, of course, that whole period, which continued into the mid 80s. So that's the short story.
Very nice. Okay, as we have your PowerPoint up and ready.
Okay, fantastic. So I'll just do a condensed version of this talk. So as I was mentioning, and the chapter title shows that, I talk a lot about this theme of immediacy in Fanon, and what I mean by that will just become apparent in a minute. So immediacy, along with its dialectical counterpoint, mediation, is of course a fulcrum for organizing much, if not all, of Fanon's over. In this essay, I shed light on two distinct but related senses of immediacy, of Fanon's immediacy. One, as I've mentioned before, the warnings, the familiarity, and indeed the viscerality of Fanon to our classically post-colonial nightmare in Pakistan. And two, in a more submerged manner, the more epistemological and political reflections on the importance of the moment of immediacy in Fanon's dialectic of experience, as Ato Sakioto has called it, and the many dangers awaiting us on this tortured road to enlightenment. It is these multi-sided actualities that will eventually bring us back to the question of mediation in Fanon and some of the, dare I say, warnings I feel emerge from Fanon for Pakistan today. Now, next slide, Feroze, thank you. So I had my first encounter, as I mentioned to you, with Fanon and the Wretched in 2011. And what struck me forcefully in that first totally uninitiated reading were not the ruminations on violence, but those deliciously disparaging comments on that most useless of all useless social classes, the national bourgeoisie of the post-colony. This was because of my own background, as I mentioned. Like many of my generation in Pakistan, I had been politicized via the anti-military dictatorship movement and the pro-democracy movement in 2007-2008. And it is amidst the inevitable disappointments and disorientations in the aftermath of the restoration of liberal democracy that Fanon's chapter on the pitfalls of national consciousness came to me, in the words of Marx, as the douse of cold water, whereby man is at last compelled to face with sober senses his real conditions of life. So in Fanon, what I found that instead of the slow cajolings of liberal democracy or some culturally ordained disposition to authoritarianism among the black and brown peoples of the world, Fanon instead was throwing down the gauntlet by asking questions such as, what was the Pakistani ruling bloc's hegemonic project? What spatial and social basis of sustainable accumulation is it based on? And what vision has it offered toiling masses beyond the crumbs and obfuscations of patrimonialism, Praetorianism, and religion? What coherent understanding of national culture has it produced? Next slide, Feroze. Thank you so much. Can we go to the next slide? Yeah. So attention, therefore, focused on the Pakistani ruling bloc as a whole, its social basis and its inadequacies rooted in an anemic productive base, and in its constitutive unwillingness, indeed its conceit in transcending its own economic corporate orientation to give enough material and ideological concessions for an expensive hegemonic project. It is this narrowness which integrally conditioned the ruling bloc's incoherence and their constant resort to military authoritarianism, imperialist dependency, and a shallow ideological cocktail of theological dissimulation, patriotic bluster, and imitation for any semblance of coherence. Narrow hegemony, of course, as Fanon reminded us, must be shored up by pomp and bluster. Can you go to the next slide? Thank you. And a brief example here will suffice. Here is a recent news story where a Pakistani real estate developer is building an exact replica of Paris with an Arc de Triomphe to boot. Consider this is the country that Pakistanis are the third biggest investors in the Dubai real estate market. This is in a country which has a housing shortage of 12 million as it stands currently. Can we go to the next slide? Mm-hmm. See how Fanon speaks to us here. And I quote Fanon, in order to hide this stagnation and to mask this regression, to reassure itself and to give itself something to boast about, the bourgeoisie can find nothing better to do than to erect grandiose buildings and to lay out money on what are called prestige expenses. End of quote. In the absence, therefore, of any integral hegemonic project, what we have, therefore, is a permanent wish for identification with a metropole, a reliance on glitz and glamour, shallow compensation via the built environment. Here is that pathology of imitation, what Fanon called this absence of all ambition, the total lack of gumption and creativity, which led Fanon to desist from conferring upon this compendium of clowns the dignity of even calling them a class. It is this inadequacy then which leads this anemic ruling bloc to rely, in Fanon's words, and I quote here, on a state which rouses the people's anxiety, immobilizes and hems them in, quote, end of quote, and therefore institutes and what Fanon called a fascism at high interest. It is, of course, that other explicator par excellence of the post-colonial condition, Ngugi wa Thiong'o, who once designated African literature of the immediate post-independence period as, and I quote Thiong'o, as a series of imaginative footnotes to Frantz Fanon, and especially to the chapter on the pitfalls of national consciousness. To this, then, I am compelled to add that the Pakistani ruling bloc may be characterized above else as a series of baleful footnotes to Frantz Fanon's nightmare. Here, then, was the first immediacy of Frantz Fanon in Pakistan, a caste of baneful inconsequence, a class which, telling me, Fanon does not even deign to dignify with the designation of a class, a post-colonial condition, as a series of baleful footnotes to the wretched of the earth. A second immediacy of Fanon in Pakistan was how he spoke to the core periphery relation. You can see the slide. The core periphery relation in the country. Those of us on the left from the quote-unquote core areas of Pakistan had always known about the many markers, at least in the quantitative sense, of underdevelopment and oppression distributed along starkly unequal regional linguistic lines. But with Fanon, it was how he speaks to the experiential weight of histories of visible, linguistic, and often epidermal inequity that revealed the sheer viscerality of the situation, what I would call the depth and density of immediacy itself. For example, in the Balochistan province, it was not just the desperate underdevelopment and rapacious robbery of national resources, but in everyday spatial markers of inequity that the hot rage of Baloch youth towards Pakistani state could be palpably felt. Here were towns and villages, colleges, everyday spaces and experience dotted with all too obvious markers of militarized humiliation and dehumanization. A primary Manichaeism here ruled social relations. This then is what Fanon called that web of three-dimensional violence, violence in everyday behavior, violence against the past that is emptied of all substance, and violence against the future, and end of quote, a concatenation of economic deprivation, linguistic cultural erasure, and everyday humiliation, which gives existential and indeed a visceral impetus to the Baloch resistance. So a politics of ethnicity here, and this is connecting to wider Pakistan left debates, a politics of ethnicity here was no quote-unquote false consciousness, a diversion from quote-unquote real struggle. In fact, it is the density of immediacy itself which compels, and I quote Fanon again here, consciousness and practice to get lost in the night of the absolute, the only condition for attaining self-consciousness, end of quote. No wonder then that the Fanon encountered here is one who speaks to the delirious Manichaeism of the colonial situation. Overdetermined by other factors, such as the weakness of the Pakistani left in general as it stands, the Fanon encountered here is not one of mediation and hegemony, but of the immediacy of violence and counter-violence. A partial uptake of Fanon, devoid of his invigorating and dialectical arc of experience, is thus mediated by the oppression of the Pakistani state and wider missing mediations of the left and working class politics. Next slide, Firoze. Thank you. Another aspect of Fanon's immediacy may be seen in the context of the recently emerged anti-war Pashtun Tahaffuz movement. Here, while Pashtuns are more integrated compared to the Baloch, more integrated generally into the state and socio-economic structures of mainstream Pakistan, a conjuncture defined by the so-called war on terror, war-induced displacement to core Pakistani cities, the many humiliations of Delhi stereotyping and surveillance within have laid the basis for new articulation of anti-war politics among young Pashtuns from disparate tribal and geographical backgrounds. Fanon here brings us our attention to the dynamic dialectic between the town and the country, the urban and the rural, the core and the periphery in the genesis and life of social movements. For here, the PTM was articulating the shifting social and spatial basis of the national question in Pakistan. It is also in this dual dialectic, that is the PTM's rootedness in the Pashtun partisan universal, what Arto Security calls the partisan universal, and its mediation articulation of the shifting core periphery urban-rural relationship in Pakistan, that it also forms potentials for a second harmony, what I would call a concrete universality, that which emerges from the historical, spatial, and indeed the experiential specificities of differentially marginalized social group, the dialectical sublation of immediacy into an insurgent universality. This then is another phenomenon we encounter in Pakistan, often one-sided and partial, but always bringing our attention to the density of immediacy itself, telling us, and I quote Fanon, to beware of crossing our arms in the sterile attitude of the spectator, but conversely to join the people, again to quote Fanon, in that fluctuating moment which they are just giving shape to. Here is the Fanon imploring us to understand in all its constitutive, historical, spatial, and experiential joints the viscerality of immediacy, not as a moment of self-enclosed particularity, but for building upon the, and what Fanon calls the open dimension of every consciousness, the progressive infrastructure of the path to disalienation. End of quote. That is with an eye ultimately on the question of mediation and therefore of hegemony itself. Can we go to the next slide? Basically, then, what we have reached in Pakistan today, I will conclude in a bit, today are two intractable, internally related realities. The culmination of a long durée crisis of the ruling bloc and increasing sections of the citizenry in insurgent mood. I have mentioned the Baloch and Pashtun cases above, but other examples may be seen too in a revived feminist movement and an emerging student movement which increasingly takes on the form of a youth insurgency. All these myriad discontents, of course, shaped by the crisis of the ruling bloc's fraying hegemony and its lack of absorptive capacity. Here is where Fanon's warning about the delicate dialectic between unevenness on the one hand and the immediacy-mediation relation gives us some troubling considerations. Okay, can we go to the next slide? We are faced here with a delicate dialectic, one where the moment of immediacy, integrally conditioned by the deep unevenness of the Pakistani social formation, cannot be missed, and indeed must be deepened substantively. On the other hand, where because of the way the social and spatial basis of production, reproduction, and accumulation have evolved, no partisan universal, no immediacy can succeed in its magnificent but aloof self-ensconcement. This is exactly where Fanon has warnings for us. For on the one hand, he dismisses prophets of a pre-given or abstract unity, what he called, and I quote Fanon, certain Pharisees wishing to skip the national stage. Philistines, and this is my own words, Philistines whose untethered universalism is abstract to the extent it fails to come to grips with the depths and densities of immediacy itself. Fanon thus advocates for a national consciousness which in his own words is not nationalism and is the only thing which will give us, which is national, revolutionary and social in the very same moment, and is the only thing, according to Fanon's words, is the only thing which will give us an international dimension. The national, and end of quote, the national, the immediate, the particular must thus deepen itself, connect to the inequities and exclusions within, work its way through that what Fanon called substantial absolutity, indeed a rapid step to be taken from national to social and political consciousness. On the other hand, here is salutary warning as well. What can be dangerous? And I quote Fanon, what can be dangerous is when they, that is the people, reach the stage of social consciousness before the stage of nationalism. If this happens, we find in underdeveloped countries fierce demands for social justice, which paradoxically are allied with often primitive tribalism. End of quote. Here is Fanon throwing down the gauntlet, one which needs to be translated with much care to Pakistan. For here we have a post-colonial state, home, and many would claim a prison, to multiple nations, with the accumulated weight of their own histories, specialities, and languages, and a situation where the very structuring of the social terrain determines an uneven, even if often mutually reinforcing development of consciousness and practice. The danger too, however, lies in the possibility of these insurgencies out of sync, times and spaces out of joint, thus missing out on the moment where partisan universals achieve that second harmony, that function of mutual imbrication and mediation, that is that of a truly plurinational unity from below, without which each rebellion stemming from its visceral immediacy, each stirring of that inimitable human quest for freedom, will wither on the poisoned wine of isolation and involution. Here then is the great danger and opportunity of the present moment of crisis in Pakistan, both an opening to forge something truly anew from below, but where the oppressive weight of the accumulated muck of past generations continues to determine the many discordances of time, space, consciousness, and insurgency. Any inadequacy in living up to this momentous historical task, however, a failure to relegate that useless cast of baneful inconsequence to its rightful place in the dustbin of history, threatens to deliver us to the same bad infinity of theological dissimulation, patriotic fraud, and militarist barbarism, but this time with a usurious interest added to it. For when a people insurgent, but only unevenly, and no longer willing to being ruled in the same old manner, faces a ruling bloc, incapable of ruling, unable to reinvent itself, and unwilling to enact its long overdue exit from the stage of history, then it might well be that we become fatefully condemned to live out Fanon's final warning, that Virgilian call of wrath and despair, that if I cannot deflect the will of heaven, then I shall move hell. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Well, where should we go? What should we, do we have questions from the audience?
Yes, we have.
I know that we're only got about 15 minutes left, so I don't want to.
Sorry, I hope that wasn't too long.
No, it was great. And we have a message from Jean Reed, another author. Fanon lives worldwide, the power of the world. Uganda Dagaskatsoi Habari from Uganda. Oh, somebody who speaks Swahili in Uganda. In Uganda, my experience is that even after independence, the ruling class placed the colonial domination in exploitative structures. There's sufficient reason for revolt in Uganda. How can we deliver organization, collaboration between justice activists all over Africa? Sandra Longwani says, hi, great discussions. Please share the slides. I leave that to you, Ayyaz, to share your slides if you're willing. Question for Feargal. If you could pick a few key books for young people on the left here in Ireland, particularly the South, to engage with the language movement and colonialism in our context, what would you recommend? Oh, I think that's a good place to start with. Feargal. Okay, I've unmuted you.
You've unmuted me. Thanks very much, Jim. Sorry, apologies for the shameless plug, but I would start with my own book, Language, Resistance and Revival, Republican Prisoners in the Irish Language in the North of Ireland, specifically looking at the language movement itself. There's also a book which we're launching next week as part of the West Belfast, as part of our festival, called Erhacht Tyree. It has an Irish subtitle, but the book's in English. Colonialism in Ireland and the Unfinished Revolution by two left-wing academics called Billy Roachton and Robbie McVeigh. And the all intents and purposes, I've only read part of it. I haven't been reading them. I'm going to try and read it all for next week, but it becomes highly recommended. It appears to be one of the most comprehensive books written about colonialism in Ireland from a left-wing perspective, and that's going to be launched here next week. And we're going to also have a recording of that. So I'm glad to share that at Feroze with our network here for anybody who wants to watch that. But those are just two books that jump out of hand. And then anything there was a pamphlet written by an activist called Martin O'Kane, who was a left-wing Republican activist based in Connemara, who was involved in a lot of protest activities in the 60s. He actually came to the North in the early 60s, and he was one of the inspirations behind the urban guilt talk, which I referenced earlier on. He had written a pamphlet called The Irish Language Movement, a Movement Astray. And what he was talking about was in the southern state, about how the Irish language movement had been commandeered by the government, and it had lost its emancipatory content, and it was something that became a means to socially exclude. And it's a very, very strong pamphlet that was used by many left-wing activists thereafter. He died in 1870, but the pamphlet was written just before his death, and it's one that I have also quoted.
Okay.
Yeah, I just want to wonder about about the question I was going to ask Wangui before about about language in around the activist networks that she's involved in, and it kind of relates to the question of what books to read, because the question, in a certain sense, is, are these books that Feargal mentioned actually, are they in Irish or are they in English? And so the question also for Wangui is, well, what about the language and about access to books and so forth, or access to material which can be used in that activists, grassroots activists and thinkers can really be engaged with.
Thanks, Nigel. If I can just say, Ayyaz, sorry to be a dictator and not talk about books as yet, even if that was the question. But Ayyaz, I was also really drawn to Fanon because, like you say, the disparaging remarks, how he saw so clearly this very useless bourgeoisie, and just how they don't have any commitment to the people. I remember for me, one narrative that sticks, and I hope I'm not confusing this with what was written in the preface, but he talks about this new elite who they'll travel to Moscow in the 60s in one day and be together with the Soviet, and then the next day they're in America. They have no ideological grounding. And for me, that I saw that a lot, because also at the time I was reading Fanon, NGOs were the most proliferating everywhere, and everyone was going for training somewhere, but there was no intention behind these trainings. And so for me, I also was drawn to Fanon because of how he saw this so clearly. I mean, we all have these contradictions, but how he saw the lack of ideological, and can you say msimamo, the backbone, and so I was drawn to that. And in terms of language, when I think about how, for example, in our organizing meeting today that we had in Mathare, some of which included, for example, a young woman who had 2 husbands killed by the police before she was 20, or another young woman whose young husband was dragged from a building site where they were building a communal tank because there's no water in Mathare, and shot in broad daylight. And if I think about the language that's there, for sure, in one sense, it's important to read pamphlets in your language, but now we operate in many languages. So young people use Sheng, which is a slang language. Their elders may use Kikuyu. And I think instead of it's really important that Ngugi writes in Kikuyu, because even me, I'm half Kikuyu, and my knowledge of Kikuyu is really minimal. But I think it's also important to emphasize the day-to-day languages that people use, which are drawing from each other and borrowing from each other. And I think ultimately, beyond the language used, I mean, the language is really important, but there's a commitment to the people. It doesn't matter if you're writing Gikuyu and you don't have commitment to the people. What needs to inform what you're writing is a commitment to the people. And so, but we need our languages at least, for sure, and to live on, because as Feargal was saying, there was a really intentional interventions to destroy the native in all senses. So we need our languages. But I think what needs to hold this or inform this bid to promote our languages is a commitment to the people, because we even have the Bible in Gikuyu. It's not going to help very many people if you have the Bible in Gikuyu, but you need to have I mean, you know what I'm saying, that can be used in many senses, but you need to have a book that's not just written in the language, but a deep commitment to perpetuating and supporting people's struggles locally and connecting them internationally. So I think I'll stop there, Nigel. I hope I answered your question about languages, and I'm very happy again to be here and to hear from Ayyaz and to hear from Feargal, and that we can make all of these connections together.
Let me ask a quick follow-up question, not only to Wangui but to all. Feargal also talks about the importance of social media. And when I was reading Feargal's chapter, I was thinking of, Fanon writing about the radio, which of course was a moment of social media for him, because the listeners to the radio were listening in groups and discussing what was being said, or in fact what they couldn't even hear on the radio. So with this idea of social media, which Feargal connects to emerging out of the Arab Spring, for example, I'm wondering how you've seen that within the social movements, whether that's been something within the Mothers Network, for example, and whether all of you would like to speak about, how social media, how important social media is, but not just simply of kind of bringing people onto the streets, but in fact being a way of exchanging ideas and for us to be, thinking through the problems that Ayyaz mentioned at the end of it, the severe problems, the heaven or hell that he mentions at the end of his talk.
Do you want me to come in first, or Wangui, or do you want to go first?
Sure, anyone.
No, just firstly, I want to take a very, very brief point. I won't labour this, because I thought the point that Wangui made there was fantastic in relation to the role of language. Because one of the things that struck me, which obviously we didn't get time to unpack, was how that when the counter-revolution happened in the southern state, the language became commandeered by the bourgeoisie. So one of the things that had to happen, the Catholic Church, who had abandoned the language 200 years previous, then became the proprietors of education. And you had to attain in the southern state a certain language qualifications to get jobs in the civil service and whatever else. So it became a means of social exclusion. One of the reasons why, paradoxically, it was so powerful in the north of Ireland was because these working class activists reclaimed it, but they reclaimed it under arguably a radical, egalitarian, liberatory lens, and all of a sudden the language had a completely different message because it was rooted in working class communities. So all the Irish language schools that have been established in the north of Ireland, just to make that a point clear, are by people who don't speak Irish originally, people who want their kids to speak Irish, and the kids are taught it immersively as a second language. But the people who set up alternative schools from the mainstream, and it became a struggle whereby still to this day we have over 7,000 young people being educated through the medium of Irish. The great majority of the schools have a huge contingent of free school meals, so they're primarily working class. So I think that's an interesting dynamic in terms of language, because a language can be emptied of its decolonizing content, or it can be engaged in a radical way. And this is one of the things that I've spoken about here, and I thought it was interesting in terms of what Wangui was saying there. But in terms of social media, I would be a bit of a Stone Age person when it comes to social media. So a lot of people in the campaign I would be somebody who wouldn't be the most au fait with technology, but I think that this is one of the things that the new generation have brought to the table. And what we talk about in the campaign is, although social media has limits, people need to connect again. In the COVID, we're speaking about this beforehand, myself and Nigel and Firoze, about how people need to come together again, and you can be zoomed out and you can be tweeted out, but the reality is social media is here to stay. So for activist groups and for movements, we have to engage it and use it as skillfully and as strategically as we possibly can to advance our cause for change. And one of the things that happened with our Daraja campaign at the end of 2016, after months of attacks by unionist ministers, when the campaign group was set up, these young people who would be 10 years younger than me put a huge emphasis on branding, put a huge emphasis on the logo of Daraja, and they were doing thunderclaps, coordinating when messages went out. They were timing them when they went out in the morning, in the afternoon, stuff that I had no idea about. But these young people knew about this, and they were learning about this because of the Arab Spring, because of other campaigns happening across the world, and because Great Power is also doing the same thing. You've Dominic Cummings and Boris Johnson and them sailing in the majority by using technology to their own advantage. So I think that this is what young people can bring to the table. And everybody has these phones, everybody has these devices, and it was hugely influential. And we were literally able to call ministers out online, and within a day that they're answering you, whereby the historic I suppose the traditional way of engaging them would have took you months. All of a sudden, if they're called out on Twitter or called out on Instagram or tagged, and the media is tagged, they're coming out and answering it, and the campaign immediately gets momentum instantaneously. Whereas in a previous generation, it would have took much longer to do that. So I think there's huge advantages to it that activist groups should be engaging with.
I mean, there's a lot of attacks made on social media and so on, but I think it's really important to emphasize its importance by saying, in contrast to social media, what we have to deal with is anti-social media, which is another word for the mainstream media, because it is antisocial. It seeks to divide, it seeks to create barriers and so on. And I think we have to, even what we're doing now is a way of bypassing anti-social media and creating conditions for conversations which otherwise would have been difficult.
Yeah. If I can, should I go, or Wangui, you want to go first? Okay, thank you. Yeah, so I mean, this law. I mean, these are questions which the question of language, social media as well. I mean, these things trouble, and something which me and a lot of our comrades we think about constantly. I mean, there's an issue of language in two senses. I mean, I'm talking from the Pakistan experience, but maybe it's relevant to other places as well. I mean, one is the more kind of direct or kind of lexical or translation issue. So in Pakistan, because there has been, such a strong, such a repressive kind of state machinery, which has, kind of almost decimated intellectual culture over the last 40 years, we just don't have the translations like in the lexical sense, the translations of, the Marxes and the Gramscis and the Fanons and so on and so forth, right? I don't think there is an Urdu translation, for example, of Black Skin, White Masks, and definitely not of dying colonialism. Or towards the African Revolution. We do have an Urdu translation of Wretched of the Earth. So there's been long eclipse in intellectual culture because of dictatorship, and then of course the fall of the Soviet Union, and then what that did to kind of critical intellectual cultures in many parts of the world, including in Pakistan. The dictatorship and the fall of the Soviet Union, the breakdown of the Communist Party, those were like one-two punch blows, which kind of decimate intellectual culture, and there is basically a long gap in terms of intellectual cultures, left critical debates, which is linked to this absence or this lack of the texts which you will often see being discussed in a place like India or Ireland and so on, because those intellectual cultures have had more continuity, I feel, in these places and cultures. The other thing about language is the more sociological sense, right? Where there is a disconnect. There's a disconnect between the languages of the ruling class or the ruling bloc and those from below. And of course, as I said, there's a disconnect in languages because of unevenness, even those who are below, right? Because of these legacies of uneven development, ethnicization, racialization, peripheralization in different parts of Pakistan. So neither is there an articulation of a quote-unquote national language, which is linked to the problem of national culture from above, right? Which exacerbates the unevenness. And neither has there been, again, because of the long eclipse of the left, a national culture, a plurinational culture from below, which is also linked to the question of language, if you see what I mean. So those are really challenges you need to think about. So, for example, the question of language, the disconnect. I mean, these COVID conspiracy theories, right? People not willing to trust the government or the state when the government asks them to do COVID masking like COVID prevention masking, go for COVID vaccination. This is the disconnect of language, right? The language that the people above are speaking. I mean, among other things, this is, for example, in Pakistan, there was a big disconnect in what the language of what the Prime Minister was saying. Lexically, they were speaking Urdu, but it was not translating or perlocating, quote unquote, down below. This is linked to a wider crisis of hegemony, wider crisis or lack of national culture, where even though lexically people might be speaking the same language, but sociologically they're not speaking the same language, right? So it's linked to this lack of hegemonic project, lack of buy-in into any kind of democratic, inclusive national culture, number one. So this is the language issue, both the lexical issue there is, but also a sociological, political issue of language, which I feel. The other issue of social media. Now, social media, I mean, I come from a very skeptical strand of social media, or people. I mean, I'm not a scholar or deep thinker on kind of media or cultural studies and so on, but what I see is social media is this, the medium itself, the form itself, I feel, is something which promotes kind of deathlessness, right? It because there's this constant cycle of news and this and that. Which kind of almost erases an erasure of context, right? I mean, this flitting of images, there's an erasure of context, erasure of historicity, this lack of depth, I feel, which is really much more amenable to fascist concerns than it is to left concerns, right? I mean, Walter Benjamin famously said that, the right thrives on the lack of historicity, on the lack of context, and the left withers on the lack of context. And social media, I feel, this constant cycle of news, images without depth, without context, they lend themselves much more easily to authoritarian projects, to fascistic projects, than I feel to critical projects. This is my feeling of it. So even though everyone gets a chance to express themselves, so there's a kind of democratization of expression, of freedom of expression, but it's like with everything in capitalism, it's a plebeian democratization. It's a pseudo democratization. So there's a democratization where everyone has a chance to give their say, but it's often people talking at each other rather than to each other, right? And the medium itself, I feel, people having these individual social media accounts. So compared to radio, I mean, what Fanon talks about in the radio is the people in the village gather together as a group, as a social collectivity in front of the radio, and then discuss that, right? In social media, what I often feel is, it fosters an activist culture rather than organizing culture. So all you are accountable to often is the likes and the retweets on the thing that you have posted. And this like almost this, momentary jouissance, momentary kind of this perverse kind of almost orgasm of the present, right? Right? That's what I would call. It's like the height of commodity fetishism, complete erasure of historicity and context and so on. So this is my kind of pessimistic understanding of social media, and how instead of fostering debate, it can actually hinder debate. And the medium itself, regardless of the content that we are putting on it, the medium itself, the medium is not neutral. The form itself, the medium itself lends itself often to kind of right-wing reactionary mobilizations. Having said that, very briefly, I mentioned the Pashtun Tahaffuz movement in my presentation and in the chapter as well, and another essay that I've written. And a lot of that, people, young Pashtun people coming from different historically divided geographical and tribal backgrounds because of colonial context, post-colonial war and so on. The urban space was very important in Pakistan in bringing these, different experiences of war and dispossession together, but also the medium of the internet and social media was very, very important. So where I have that pessimistic take, I think there needs to be a lot of thought going into, yes, we have seen that social media can become a platform to bring together these kind of dispersed wills and experiences and, mutual mediation and mutual kind of seeding of, movements and thinking and activism and so on. But even in these instances, what I've seen is that often what happens is that some people become like, quote unquote activists, and then movements emerge, but then they also have they emerge very quickly and then they go down very quickly, and I often feel that a lot of that is down to the medium of social media, the kind of debate or lack of debate it encourages, and the kind of depthlessness and contextlessness that it encourages. So I'm kind of conflicted with these social media terms. Absolutely, you're right. I'm not a Luddite. I use Facebook itself, so I'm not a Luddite. I'm not saying that we have to discard social media, but I think there needs to be a lot of thinking on the left in critical radical circles as to how these mediums have to be used, primarily so that we foster organizing cultures, building institutional cultures, rather than social media being an individualizing tool, being an activistic tool, by individualizing, being an almost anti-political neoliberal tool, rather than an organizing tool. So sorry, these are some of my scattered thoughts on the social media question and the language question.
Thank you. Thank you for that. We have run out of time, and I just want to thank all of you for your presentations and for the discussion. You know, Fanon famously says that each generation out of relative obscurity has to discover its mission. But I also think what today's discussion has shown is the deep kind of connections between these struggles, between these struggles, and also the ways in which thinkers like Fanon, as well as others, are part of the kind of archive of the struggle as well that we have. And also that this will also be on social media. You'll be able to see us again if you click on YouTube. And with that, thank you so much, everyone. And I hand it over to Feroze.
Thank you very much, all of you, for joining us on this show. I'm sorry that we've had to end the show when the discussion is really only beginning to develop. Thank you, all of you who have participated and posed questions on today's discussion. Fanon Today, The Reason and Revolt of the Wretched of the Earth, is available from the Daraja Press website at darajapress.com. Thank you all for joining us. If our panelists would just remain on the show if they can, and while we end the broadcast, so we can have a final chat together.